Good evening, and welcome to the Silas Peirce Lecture, which is part of the Arts and Sciences lecture series that's held each year at the BU College of Arts and Sciences. This year, we are especially excited as the lecture kicks off events in celebration of our 150th anniversary of the College of Arts and Sciences. We were founded 150 years ago next month, on March 14th, 1873. I'm Stan Sklaroff, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and I'm delighted to see so many people joining us here tonight in Sci Auditorium and from around the globe via our online community. This special event is a fitting one to launch our 150th anniversary events, as it is made possible by the Silas Peirce Fund, which was established by the heirs of Silas Peirce, treasurer of Boston University from 1911 to 1922, and Boston University trustee from 1899 to 1922. The annual Silas Peirce Lecture is open to all fields of inquiry covered within the College of Arts and Sciences. The Silas Peirce Lecture is designed to represent different fields across the different years. In past years, topics have included bias, sustainability, baseball, gender, and the possibility of water on Mars, to name a few. These lectures bring our community together across disciplines and across colleges and bring together interested faculty, students, alumni, staff, and parents from around the nation and from around the world. I'm honored that this year's guest, Dr. Kira Thurman, has agreed to talk to us about her work, because her work truly transcends borders, boundaries, and academic fields. It even crosses oceans. A native of Vienna, Austria, and professor at the University of Michigan, Kira is a historian and musicologist, as well as a classically trained pianist. Her research focuses on the relationship between music and national identity, and the historical and contemporary relationship with the Black diaspora in Central Europe, where she grew up. Before Kira speaks, I want to introduce Professor Anthony Petro, our National Endowment for the Humanities Distinguished Teaching Professor, whose work also transcends disciplines. Anthony is an associate professor in the Department of Religion and in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. His teaching and research interests include religion and culture in the United States, religion, medicine, and public health, and gender and sexuality studies. He also led BU's new Health Humanities project. He is currently writing a new book called Provoking Religion, Sex, Art, and the Sacred in the Modern United States, which traces heated debates over sex, art, race, and religion to reveal competing genealogies of the sacred and the secular in the modern US, especially during the heyday of the culture wars. It explores how a range of feminist and queer artists have engaged religious themes and ritual in their work. Anthony will now introduce Kira and later moderate our Q&A after Kira's talk. I encourage both our in-person audience and live stream audience to submit questions. Anthony?
Thank you, Stan, and thank you all for coming tonight, both in person and via live stream. I have the privilege of introducing our special guest tonight, and I'm honored to do so. As Dean Sklaroff mentioned, Kira Thurman is a highly sought-after and award-winning historian and musicologist. At the University of Michigan, she has appointments in history, German studies, and musicology. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Rochester with a minor field in musicology from the Eastman School of Music. Her research focuses on the relationship between music and national identity, and on Central Europe's historical and contemporary relationship with the Black diaspora. She is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including a Fulbright Fellowship to Germany, the Berlin Prize from the American Academy of Berlin, and a residential fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Her book, Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, was published by Cornell University Press in 2021. It traces the history of Black classical musicians. Got it. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I thought we had this one on. All right, thank you. Writing for The New Yorker, music critic Alex Ross praised the book as, in his words, one of the most original and revelatory books to have been written about classical music history in many years, an instant classic that deserves the widest possible audience. Singing Like Germans has won several prizes, including the Marfield Prize of the National Award for Arts Writing and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Ralph Gleason Book Award. NPR even named it one of the best books of 2021. Professor Thurman is currently developing several new projects spanning topics that include Afro-European pop music, race and data visualization in modern Germany, and the history of Black classical musicians. A firm believer in public engagement, Thurman has written for outlets such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Friese magazine, and has appeared on PBS documentaries and public radio programs in Germany and the United States. She has written historical materials for orchestras such as the BBC Proms in London, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Aspen Music Festival, and the New York Philharmonic. Together with colleagues across the United States and Europe, and with support of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., she runs the public history website, blackcentraleurope.com. When we were dreaming up possible speakers for the Peirce Lecture, we wanted to think big. Who is doing truly exciting work that really appeals to scholars and audiences across fields? Professor Thurman quickly came to mind. She has appointments in the departments of history, German, and musicology. Her research and teaching range from the history of classical music to the history of Nazi Germany, to the politics of race and sexuality and the performances of work by Richard Wagner, to music across the Black Atlantic. She writes for scholars and for the wider reading public alike, from tweets on the question of whether Beethoven was Black that went viral, to appearing on the podcast Getting Curious with Queer Eye's own Jonathan Van Ness. In case you didn't think I was going to bring that up, of course I was going to bring that up. It's a privilege to have her here with us tonight. Her talk is called On Beethoven, Blackness, and Belonging, Debating German Music Across the Black Atlantic. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kira Thurman.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here, for being here on a Monday night when you might want to be in your pajamas watching HBO. Thanks so much also to the Arts and Sciences for hosting me and having me. It's just been such a wonderful, lovely experience to be here at Boston University. Without further ado, I'm going to get into it. As Professor Petro mentioned, I wear many different hats, a musicology hat, German history hat, and the like. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is related to my book, but also kind of goes beyond that. So I'll just go ahead and get started and just reiterate that, as everybody's been saying, I'm a German historian by training and an honorary musicologist among close friends and family. And normally I do share presentations about German reception of African-American classical musicians. I look at how German audiences made sense of Black musicians' interpretations of the Austro-German musical canon of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, those like really important composers. And I look at how Germans are understanding Black musicians, like these figures here we're going to be talking about, how they're understanding their interpretations across the 19th and 20th centuries. So my question that was very much at the heart of my book was like, how would white Germans react to their music, which they thought of as the most sophisticated and elite, performed by Black people who they often denigrated as the most primitive? And that's still very much the heart of my book. But as I started writing it, some of my colleagues asked me a really important question, which was, for a lot of the musicians that we see here, like, how did they get into classical music in the first place? And I realized that I didn't really have a good answer for it. So I began to start researching this question pretty seriously starting in 2015, where I had this wonderful summer spent bopping around from archive to archive at different historically Black colleges and universities. So I went to Howard University's archive, looking through their yearbooks and course catalogs. I spent weeks in Nashville, Tennessee, visiting Fisk University, chatting with their archivists, which was so lovely. And I spent most of the summer in my parents' basement in Atlanta, which they loved, going to Spelman College and Morehouse College's archives, and Clark Atlanta University as well, to visit their collections. Again, they were thrilled, as was our family dog, Beasley at the time. And as I was doing this project of going to different historically Black colleges and looking around to see how they had set up their music departments in particular, I realized that this project of hunting down the lives, careers, motivations, dreams, and desires of African-American classical musicians was actually really personal to me. So you see, I am a Black classical musician, and I have faced my whole life questions about this supposedly strange fact. At airports going through TSA security, I would tell security guards in college that I was studying music, and the first question that they would ask was like, "Oh, jazz?" Nope. My favorite composer to play on the piano is Joseph Haydn. Why, I always thought, would people ask me if I played jazz? And why do they always assume that I'm a singer instead of an instrumentalist? The answer, of course, is that there's very little about the world of classical music today that encourages us to see Black people in it. African Americans represent only 1.8% of all orchestra musicians today, for example. Oh, this is my book, Right We, on sale now. So Alex Ross, perhaps the most well-known music critic in America today, he railed about this in an essay for The New Yorker back in 2017. Attacking the programming choices of the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera House head on, he writes that in the age of Trump, quote, "As a nation contends with this racist and misogynist demons, New York's leading musical institutions give us canonical pieces by white males, conducted by white males, directed by white males." And he's not wrong. Look at this really cool graph put together on GitHub ages ago, illustrating the programming choices of the New York Philharmonic since 1850. It reinforces the notion that the best pieces of music were ones written in the past, usually by white European men. Looking into the history of structural and systemic racism in American classical music, looking into this history for me as a German historian has also occasionally given me the sensation of experiencing some sort of intellectual whiplash. That the mythology of color blindness in classical music has meant that there are far fewer studies, whether historical or sociological, examining racial data in classical music in America than we might assume. And I found this out the hard way by asking very lovely archivists at conservatories of music across the United States for their records on Black students before 1945, only to be told quite sheepishly by some that their conservatory had had a policy of not admitting any Black students until the 1950s. They had no records to give me. Worse, perhaps, might be the moments when I read institutional histories boasting that their school never had a racial problem, such as the New England Conservatory of Music, knowing the whole time that African-American student Maud Cuny Hare had been forbidden from living in a dorm with white students until Boston's Black elites protested on her behalf. Prior to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, were African-Americans able to enter a symphony orchestra hall or any opera house that they wished? That's a question that musicologists such as Carol Ocha and Gavin James Campbell have been trying to answer in ways that move beyond the anecdotal. But headlines, such as the one you see here about African Americans turned away from a piano recital, indicate the negative. So then why do it, my friends have asked me? Why perform music that bears with it the legacies of racism and Western cultural hegemony? Of course, we could make arguments about aesthetics. I play this music because I love it. I turn to this music in times of profound grief and in moments of exquisite joy. But being a historian, I wanted to consider how African Americans navigated these questions themselves, how they insisted on loving this music anyway. I want to know how African Americans made classical music a meaningful part of their lives. Was it possible for there to be a Black tradition to performing and listening to classical music? So what I'm going to focus on for today's talk is on how African Americans understood, made sense of, and then made different claims to classical music from the end of the Civil War through the Harlem Renaissance, so like 1870s to 1930s. And in doing so, I want to account for Black involvement in the production and dissemination of classical music in the United States. And so here I'm joining a growing number of scholars tackling this question about race and classical music. And they're making us see composers such as Antonin Dvorak and Florence Price and others in a completely new light. So like different musicologists right now, I'm not exactly satisfied with some of the frameworks that we have been using to examine the lives and careers of African American classical musicians. Instead of thinking of African Americans as simply empty vessels waiting to be filled with the glorious knowledge of Brahms, or as passive consumers of white-dominated media, I want us to consider how they were active in their own propagation of what the music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms meant to them. So simply by shifting our focus onto Black agency in the production of classical music, we can dismantle the notion that classical music dissemination in America was unidirectional. I must point out the Germanness of my investigation here, because German music is what's going to be central to what we're looking at today. And I promise I'm not just saying that because I'm a German historian, that African American debates about classical music had a particularly German focus to them because the canon of classical music is overwhelmingly German. So German music scholars have been arguing for decades now it's a bit of a paradox. It presents itself as both national and universal, like there's one true universal music. This paradox of German art music has left a profound legacy in American history. The German musical tradition dominated music schools at newly founded American conservatories of music in the late 19th century, like New England Conservatory. It dictated musical programming of orchestras and opera houses. It commanded the migration of American and German bodies across the Atlantic and shaped the lives and careers of generations of music lovers. Doug Shadle writes, quote, "There can be no doubt that the sacralization of art, fueled by the desire for German music of whatever brand, left a lasting imprint on the culture of classical music that is still with us today." So by the late 19th century, the joke in the United States was that there were two kinds of music, German music and bad music. So, the framework that I have found helpful lately to thinking about Black engagements with German music comes from a body of scholarly works in the field of African American history studies and literature on the topic of Black internationalism. Black internationalism, as the historian Keisha Blaine describes it, quote, "captures African Americans' global racial consciousness," end quote. And historians of Black internationalism document the rise in an emerging Black political culture that was responding to slavery, colonialism, and white supremacy. Black internationalism is and has always been about how Black people have looked outward, beyond their nation state, to find both liberation and collaborators willing to help bring about their political freedom. So often, different historical writings on Black internationalism stress the forging of Black diasporic links, Garveyism spreading around the world, James Baldwin's connections to people of African descent in Paris, these kinds of things. But there are examples of Black Americans working with white non-Americans that can provide us with a pathway forward to investigating African Americans in classical music. So for example, in her book, The Cold War and the Color Line, Kate Baldwin argues that instead of seeing African Americans as naive converts consuming Soviet ideology and then parroting it back, like what if we recognize the agency of African American intellectuals who promoted Soviet internationalism? So by flipping the script, she argues, we come to see that African Americans saw Soviet internationalism as an escape from oppressive old systems. African American writings on Soviet Russia weren't simply blind followings of Soviet ideology, Baldwin argues, but rather acts of resistance. So could German musical universalism have offered something similar to Black people? Could listening to, playing, and critiquing a Mozart piano sonata be interpreted as moments of defiance? What might it look like or sound like to our ears if we heard Black writings of the great masters as a deliberate strategy of Black cultural politics in the Jim Crow era? So the way that the rest of this talk is going to go is like part one, I'm going to offer a brief social history of African Americans in classical music. Part two is going to look at how they start rewriting music history in really interesting ways. And then the last part, I'm turning to W.E.B. Du Bois. So for part one, African Americans and German music, a brief social history. So this question, how did Black people get into classical music? Well, on the one hand, you could say that they've always been there. And it's so interesting that we're having this conversation about discovering Black composers these days. When nonetheless, let me see if I have a slide. I don't have a slide for this one. But there have been different historical figures in the past, going back to like the 15th century in Portugal with Vicente Lusitano and people like that. But at least in the American case, I'm just going to speak about that one, we can turn to a few specific moments. So after the Civil War and the abolishing of slavery, we start seeing more Black Americans become what we consider to be working professional musicians. And this happens in spite of mainstream and usually white American society, by the way, who generally refuse to grant them access to conservatories of music or even let them in their music halls. So being resourceful in spite of white violence, Black Americans decided to often build their own institutions themselves. The greatest way that we can see that is through the creation of historically Black colleges and universities. So for example, Fisk University, and that's what we're going to focus on right now, located in Nashville, Tennessee, was one of the most important epicenters in Black America for classical music, modeling their institute on both Oberlin's Conservatory of Music and on the New England Conservatory of Music as well. Both of which I have to say, were just mimicking the Leipzig Conservatory of Music in Germany, but whatever. So by 1896, the newly formed Conservatory of Music at Fisk University had 132 pupils studying piano, organ, violin, or voice. Their roster of Black faculty had trained at some of the most renowned conservatories of music as well, and Fisk University's music library had collected original letters by composers such as Franz Liszt, Beethoven, Richard Wagner, and Carl Maria von Weber. By 1922, a 25-member student and faculty orchestra had organized to perform symphonies and choral orchestral works for the community. And for decades, the Mozart Society, which is this image here, the Mozart Society, this mixed choral ensemble that had formed in 1881, they were a real source of pride for Fisk University, and they performed large choral works by Mendelssohn, Bach, Brahms, and other composers. And then this is what I found in the archive in 2015, back when I was living in my parents' basement and just kind of traveling around a lot, which is the course catalog of piano instruction. And what you can notice about it is like how overwhelmingly German the different composers are that students are expected to learn at Fisk University in 1896. So. Right, but the problem nonetheless remains, like we see how Black people begin to gain access to classical music in spite of white violence, in spite of discrimination, in spite of threats. But what opportunities did they have to succeed outside of an HBCU? And so here's where we need to start addressing the long history of systemic racism in classical music against Black people. That there are so many examples of Black people trying to get in, but being shut out. Being told at auditions that they weren't good enough and not knowing what to believe. Marian Anderson and Nina Simone both talk about that, by the way, that racism makes you paranoid. Were they really being rejected by the Curtis Institute of Music because they weren't good enough? Or was it because they were Black? At least Nina Simone's teachers were honest enough with her to tell her that it was the latter, and that they'd found that out from the committee after her audition. So two examples that I find striking that we're going to talk about that illustrate this problem. Number one is Jean Costen, a brilliant pianist that studied at Oberlin College in the 1930s. She had studied abroad also in Denmark with pianist Axel Skjerne and won Oberlin's tough piano concerto competition. And what is so interesting is I find in the archives her professors who were anxiously fretting about her in letters back and forth to each other. They don't know what to do because she's fallen into a depression. Her piano teachers write in a memo, quote, "Her feeling earlier seemed to be that because she is colored and wouldn't have a chance to do anything worthwhile when she leaves Oberlin, that there was little use in trying." And here's the thing, she was right. She was so right. Has anybody heard of Jean Costen? No. No, what was a Black woman instrumentalist supposed to do in the 1930s? Another incident from 1925, which is also so striking, is when the Italian opera singer Edoardo Ferrari Fontana staged a competition at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City to find a Black woman to sing Verdi's Aida. He confessed, "It has always been a mystery to me why impresarios have not sought a Negro voice for an opera like Aida," end quote. Much to the shock and later horror of the Metropolitan Opera House, over 250 women responded to Ferrari Fontana's request for Black singers, all stating that they were ready to sing the part. And many of them were. Classical trained singers such as Muriel Rahn here, who in 1959 became the first Black musical director of what we now call the Frankfurt Opera, which is like this huge opera house, avant-garde opera house. Florence Cole Talbert, the first Black woman to perform Verdi's Aida in Europe, they were both shortlisted. Yet despite the overwhelming proliferation of letters and telegrams seeking an audition, the Metropolitan Opera House shut down this vocal experiment. So to make this into some sort of experiment, let's say you're a talented Black violinist in the 1950s, born and raised right here in Boston. What options are available to you? As far as I've been able to ascertain after digging through so many records and the like, I kind of boiled it down to 3. Like, 1, you can try to get by with a middling career, knowing you're probably not going to land an orchestra gig or be a concertizing soloist. Number 2, you leave classical music altogether. Think of Nina Simone, who did that, Miles Davis, who also did it, and others. Will Marion Cook, he's the first Black producer on Broadway. He is a classically trained violinist who studied at the Royal Conservatory of Berlin in the 1890s, and he also leaves classical music, unable to break through. So we see, 2 choices: try to struggle with a middling career, switch to popular music or something else altogether. But the last option is where my book project comes in and where I come in, because this last option became increasingly appealing to many. Go to Europe. Go to Europe. Europe, many Black people thought, could be the land of acceptance for them. Europeans could understand them if Americans refused to. And so we see lots of examples of this. When asked by an American journalist in 1897 if there was a difference in her reception between American and European audiences, the opera singer Cicieretta Jones responded, "Yes, a marked difference. In Europe, there is no prejudice against my race. It matters not to them in what garb an artist come, so he be an artist. It is the artist's soul they look at there, not the color of his skin." About a decade later, the African-American violinist and recent transplant to Europe, Clarence Cameron White, made the same argument in an interview with the African-American newspaper, The New York Age. Quote, "On every side, you find that the European musician and music lover as well realizes that music is too broad and too universal to be circumscribed by the complexion of the skin or texture of the hair." This isn't true, by the way. That's what my book looks at. White German audiences and Austrian audiences totally racialized them. They were totally exoticized, racialized in all kinds of ways that is at the center of my book. But nonetheless, what's interesting is that their statements were more often than not, less about Europe and more indictments of American racism. But what matters here that I think we need to hold on to is that Black people were looking for freedom. They were looking for places where they could finally be accepted because they couldn't find that in America. The reason why African Americans began to argue this line of thinking, by the way, is because of German immigrant musicians who worked with African American classical musicians at times when white Americans wouldn't. And I'm happy to talk about this perhaps also in the Q&A, that the range of Black musicians studying with German teachers in the United States, it's wild. It's everybody from Scott Joplin, the founder of ragtime, or the grandpapa of ragtime, who towards the end of it, he had had a German Jewish piano teacher named Julius Weiss, who he financially supported the last 10 years of his piano teacher's life. We have figures like Harry Lawrence Freeman, pianists such as Nina Simone, who is, by the way, a direct musical descendant of Clara Schumann, which is wild. Hazel Harrison, who performed with the Berlin Philharmonic in 1904. I mean, the list goes on and on of Black musicians who studied with German teachers. So it would be naive to believe that these German musicians were somehow entirely free from the politics of American racism, nor should we see them as rescuers of Black musical talent, plucking young African Americans from a path of obscurity to reveal to them their true musical promise. African Americans, of course, were the ones hungry for training, compelled by a desire to sing, play, and listen to music that consumed their thoughts. They were the ones who sought out teachers, requested auditions, and set up music lessons for their own musical and intellectual growth, often at great financial and social expense. But what does remain striking is the international nature of these collaborations to me. If a Black musician were to succeed in the world of classical music, the likelihood that a musician from Germany, or at least from outside the United States, was behind this musician's career was fairly high. The transnational nature of the relationship might have permitted German teachers to imagine other possibilities of being for their Black students, not seeing Black lives and potential careers solely through the lens of American race relations. And it might have encouraged Black students to find meaning and beauty beyond America's shores. So, Europe loomed in Black Americans' imagination as a promised land of sorts, a place where they could finally be free to be both Black and classical musicians. It was a place where the harsh and violent rules of racism couldn't determine their lives. It was also a space where they believed they could claim classical music on their own terms. What they all argued was that classical music wasn't white. America had made it white, but it wasn't actually. Instead, it was something that they could also claim, but on different grounds. So this is the next part that we're going to be doing, is part 2, making Beethoven Black, on Black intellectuals and rewriting music history. I think to not distract us too much, I think there's a way I can probably mute this like this. Nope. No, okay, yes, okay. I will go back to this one for now though, and then we'll come back to the images. So on part 2, making Beethoven Black, which is the next part of this talk, so scholars such as the historian Kevin Gaines and others have, in a lot of ways, I think rightly dismissed Black interest in high art in the late 19th and early 20th century. They've kind of dismissed it as mere respectability politics. And like I said, to a certain degree, I do think they're right. Documents that I found in archives at HBCUs like Fisk University or Morehouse and the like, these documents, they constantly espouse the belief that art music is what should be used to uplift the race, sort of deeming it morally superior. And these different student newspapers and other documents that I found also express this growing fear that Black popular music was undermining the cause of Black social advancement. So in the 1890s, for example, student newspapers at HBCUs denounced ragtime. And in the 1920s, Hampton University, Fisk, Howard, and other schools were actively curtailing any student interest in jazz for fear of its harmful effects on Black social mobility and respectability. So the music of Schubert and Handel, teachers and writers often argued, that was what was supposed to offer the brightest path forward to a positive musical future. But respectability politics is not the only prism through which we can understand Black writings and conversations on German art music. So using that framework of Black internationalism that I mentioned earlier, we can think about African American intellectuals and musicians who had moved beyond respectability politics in trying to evaluate the meaning and purpose of the Austro-German canon to their lives. And what's so interesting to me is what we see is that this German romantic message of universalism, that German music is the most universal, we see this being internalized and reappropriated for Black causes. So German's musical universality meant that Black people, not only white people, could claim the music as theirs. So we see how Black musicians laid claim to German music in two ways. First, they began to locate Blackness in classical music itself, and this is what I'm going to talk about for a minute. So what they start doing is arguing that many German composers had been influenced by Black musical idioms and expressions for much longer than the public records showed. So we're going to look at how they began to locate Blackness in classical music itself. And then second, as we'll see, Black writers began to write Black people into histories of Western art music as well. So to the first point about locating Blackness in classical music itself, we might have the composer Antonin Dvorak to thank or blame in part for fostering the notion that Western art music might have historical Black roots. He is truly the most legendary figure in a lot of ways for advocating for the use of Negro music as the basis for classical compositions. And he stated in an interview that, quote, "All the great musicians have borrowed from the songs of the common people. Beethoven's most charming scherzo is based upon what might now be considered a skillfully handled Negro melody. I have myself gone to the simple half-gotten tunes of the Bohemian peasants for hints in my most serious work." So this idea that Beethoven's music might have a Black context to it gets bantered back and forth for years after Dvorak's remark. So here's one quote, from a year later in 1894 in the Cleveland Gazette, quote, "When Beethoven was writing the Moonlight Sonata for a colored piano player from New Orleans who was making a tour of Germany, he asked the American for a motif that was purely Afro-American. But the only tune that the American knew to be of New Orleans creation was a simple air sung by the Creoles. Anyone who knows the old airs of Provence will find one in the motif of the first part of the Moonlight Sonata." So, right, this idea again of like Beethoven's music has some sort of Black origin story to it. This idea gets legitimized, I should say, later on by the African-American musicologist and New England Conservatory of Music alum Maud Cuny Hare, whose landmark book from 1936, Negro Music and Negro Musicians and Their Music, it's a classic blockbuster book. In this book, the survey, she argued that composer Ludwig van Beethoven had borrowed from African-American musical idioms, sort of writing that, in particular, Beethoven's Sonata in E for violin and piano, the Allegro movement in it is, quote, "said to have embodied a Negro folk theme," she writes. So as these quotes suggest, hearing the music of Beethoven in a key of Blackness suggested that Black music making was and had always been a noble endeavor. But African Americans also found another way to lay claim to German music. And this brings me to the second way that they're going to reimagine German musical universalism. So they're going to start pointing out Black figures in Western art music history as well. This is a project, I should say, begun in earnest. Let me double check. This is a project begun in earnest in the 1870s with the musicologist James Monroe Trotter, but it really flourishes in the 1920s and 30s during the Harlem Renaissance, when we have a new generation of university-educated African Americans begin to turn their gaze towards a broader musical past. And as historians such as Earl Lewis and Robin Kelly have argued, the histories that they're writing in the 1920s and 30s, it belongs to this greater historiographical project to really institutionalize Black history and to participate in the documentation of Black diasporic lives in global history, a project led by, for example, Arturo Schomburg, among others. So writing against the Hegelian notion that Black people were a people without history, these figures instead located Black stories and Black bodies at the center of Western cultural production. Their texts argued that not only had Black people always been involved in Western art music, but that African Americans as a musical people were the inheritors of this sort of legacy of musical excellence. So the talent and genius lay within them, if only they could shirk off the oppressive chains of racism, preventing them from achieving nearly unimaginable success. So a historical figure that became a point of fixation for Black intellectuals and classical musicians in the 1920s and 30s and 40s was the Afro-European violinist George Bridgetower, who was the son of an Afro-Caribbean servant and a Polish mother at the Esterhazy Palace. So like here he is. This is a figure. He's from the time of Beethoven. He was a talented violinist who had most likely studied with Franz Haydn, and he definitely performed with Haydn in Vienna, we do know that. And George Bridgetower also formed a friendship with the composer Ludwig van Beethoven in 1803. Beethoven dedicated a violin sonata to him until, in like very Beethoven fashion, they had a fight over a girl. And then Beethoven changed the dedication away from Bridgetower to Rudolf Kreutzer, which is now known as the Kreutzer Sonata. And it's so funny, he dedicated it to Rudolf Kreutzer, who was this violinist, and the piece was apparently so hard that Kreutzer was like, I can't play it. I don't want to play this. Like, why did you dedicate this to me? I hate this piece. So, right, a little bit of backstory there too. Right, so Black interest in George Bridgetower began in earnest in 1927 when Maud Cuny Hare, again the New England Conservatory of Music alum and musicologist, when she began to write about him for the Black civil rights organ, The Crisis, which you see here, which is a paper of W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, etc. So having read newly translated biographies of Beethoven herself, Maud Cuny Hare had been lecturing on Beethoven around the United States prior to the appearance of this essay. And after attending one of her lectures, Du Bois wrote to her to ask her if she would be willing to publish an essay on Bridgetower for The Crisis. So 1927 was the centenary of Beethoven's death. It was a big year for celebrating all things Beethoven. And so Maud Cuny Hare's essay begins by noting that out of all of the texts that had appeared on Beethoven that year to celebrate this anniversary, none of them had mentioned Beethoven's friendship to a Black man. So her essay, using documents that she herself had collected in the British Library in London and from archives in Vienna, this essay tried to correct this gross oversight and empower Black readers to look into a greater Black musical past that spanned the entire Atlantic Ocean. So subsequent publications of Bridgetower's biography by other African-American scholars, they were always tied to his friendship to Beethoven, and they began to appear regularly in Black publications in the 1930s and 40s onward, all using Bridgetower to affirm their own rightful place in classical music. So to summarize really quickly, on sort of Black claims to German music. So one, that Black musicians and intellectuals began to attribute German musical compositions to Black music. And two, that musicologists such as Maud Cuny Hare began to publish biographies of Black musicians within Western art music as a way to insist that Black people belong to classical music. I think these two factors help us to understand why, by the 1940s, some African Americans had begun to argue that the composer Ludwig van Beethoven was Black. So there's a really helpful book on this, Beethoven in America by Michael Broyle, which gives a little bit about this discourse as well. And it focuses on this sort of polemical stance, but mostly during the civil rights era with figures such as Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X and how they began to espouse it in like the 60s. But this discourse, I discovered, actually begins much earlier than that, in the 1930s and 40s, and it's begun by musicians, not by activists. I'm not going to argue if Beethoven was or wasn't Black, because that's not the point. Rather, I see it as no coincidence that writing on Beethoven's Blackness frequently mentioned George Bridgetower and cite scholarship that insisted that Beethoven had been inspired by Negro melodies as evidence of their claims. Black genius, these writings argued, was everywhere, located even in the most quote-unquote universal of composers, Beethoven, and even in historical past where people thought Blackness did not reside. Germany, it turns out, was a site of the Black diaspora, a land where Black musicians had long resided. It is in this context and in this spirit where any kind of untouched or previously unthinkable Black history suddenly felt possible that we find this idea of a Black Beethoven emerge. To whom did Beethoven belong? Who in America could claim the great German masters? As Black historians, musicologists, and public intellectuals rewrote music history, they found new and empowering answers to those questions. The great German masters did not belong to white people. The great German masters were not even white. Their music and biographies were meant for all, including, or especially, Black people. So the last part of today's talk, we're going to focus on W.E.B. Du Bois. Perhaps the most radical use of German music in the service of Black cultural politics came from W.E.B. Du Bois. His sustained writings on German music over the course of his career from the 1890s through the 1950s fostered this message of alterity that few in his lifetime grasped or perhaps appreciated. Du Bois argued that German music offered not only legitimation of Black talent, but liberation out of white supremacist America. Calling for a new kind of universalism, W.E.B. Du Bois was explicit about what German music's potentials were to Black transformation. W.E.B. Du Bois had been a student in Germany in the 1890s, and his experience there greatly affected his musical and political worldview. Going to hear operas and orchestra concerts, Du Bois came to discover for himself while in Germany that classical music was not rooted in white American values. He writes in his autobiography that in Germany, quote, "Even I was a little startled to realize how much that I had regarded as white American was white European and not American at all. America's music is German," the Germans said. "The Americans have no art," said the Italians. "And their literature," remarked the English, "is mainly English." Sometimes their criticism got under even my anti-American skin, but it was refreshing on the whole to hear voiced my own attitude towards so much that America had meant to me. So in Germany, listening to Beethoven symphonies and going to a Wagner opera, Du Bois discovered that he could love and lay claim to the same cultural works as white Americans, but on different grounds. So we see most clearly German musical culture's value to the struggle of Black liberation in his 1928 novel, The Dark Princess, which is what I'm going to be talking about now. And I'm going to set the story a little bit first before we get to this passage. So the way that this novel begins is like this. So in the United States, there is a brilliant medical student, Black medical student named Matthew Towns. And he's just been denied entry into the field of obstetrics from an elite white university, despite his excellent grades and academic achievements. So sad, enraged, and dejected, he writes to his mother that he is done living in the United States and he departs on a ship to Germany. So sitting in a cafe on Unter den Linden in Berlin, he wallows in sadness, looking for love in all the wrong places, and pondering the racial differences between Germany and the United States when he sees a woman, quote, of golden brown skin, who immediately captures his attention. It turns out that the woman is a beautiful princess from South Asia. After she strikes up a conversation with him, she invites him to attend a dinner party with her friends, all of whom are global cosmopolitans from China, Japan, South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and Egypt. German music plays a pivotal role in the protagonist's discovery of himself. At dinner that evening, the international group of intellectuals begin to debate the merits of composer Arnold Schoenberg's new transcription of a Bach piece. And in order to resolve this debate that they're all having, the princess at one point sort of gets up, stands up, stomps off, and sits down at the piano in the drawing room, and she begins to play the music in question. And hearing this transcription of a Bach chorale awakened something deep and profound in the protagonist. Du Bois writes, quote, "Again, Matthew felt his lack of culture audible, and not simply of his own culture, but of all the culture in white America, which he had unconsciously and foolishly, as he now realized, made his norm." The beauty of Bach and other composers had been kept from Towns. Because he had tried to adhere to the norms of white American society as a Black man, he had missed out on the joys and beauties of classical music to which he had been denied access. Yet among his fellow intellectuals from the global South, Towns discovered, quote, culture, wealth, and beauty. Here was power, and here he had some recognized part, end quote. Because of an Indian aristocratic woman playing the music of Bach, Towns is forever transformed. What is so interesting about this tale, and also other writings of Du Bois, is that classical music's universality had nothing to do with whiteness to Du Bois. Rather, what the main character comes to realize during his conversation with these elite men from Japan and from China and the Arabian Peninsula is that, quote, the present white hegemony of the world is nonsense. White Europeans and Americans had kept people of color around the world from becoming their full magisterial selves. It was time, they all agreed, as they listened to Schoenberg's transcription of Bach, to upend the global social order and revolutionize the world. If they were to liberate classical music from the racist confines of whiteness, it could finally, truly, be universal music. So, my conclusion. I'd like to conclude my paper on German music and universalism and Black politics by introducing one more framework. This happened back in, 2017 when I was at the American Academy in Berlin, and the post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak came to give a talk. She's of, the famous text Can the Subaltern Speak, blah, blah, blah. And she used this phrase in her talk that I'm still thinking about. And the phrase is this: affirmative sabotage. Affirmative sabotage. And it's so funny, at the time she was speaking, she gave a talk on W.E.B. Du Bois and on his relationship with anti-colonialist South Asian activists and thinkers. And in this talk, she argued that Du Bois wasn't simply influenced, quote unquote, by the Enlightenment, so much as he managed to successfully sabotage it. He took the Enlightenment to a place where it needed to be reconstituted, she argues, because he had found it wanting or insufficient. Spivak calls this affirmative sabotage because the participant knows the technology so well that they understand how to repurpose it to make it function for their own needs and desires. It is possible, in her estimation, for people to admire the machinery that they are trying to change, a technology that might be as destructive to their being as it is beautiful. Since the technology was not built for them, they are not supposed to be able to use it. But they can sabotage the device so that it no longer is what it once was. This might sound abstract, but I think using the term affirmative sabotage helps us to investigate both the mutability of German music and the immense power of Black cultural politics in the United States. Employing it helps us to see that the practice of listening to and performing German art music in the United States was never monolithic. German music in this formation meant something different for Black classical musicians than it did for white classical musicians in the era of Jim Crow, a time of lynchings, rape, and racial violence. And Black classical musicians planned to use it differently as well. How some African Americans were able to take on this music, which I should say by the 1930s, other African Americans such as Langston Hughes were denouncing as white and of the oppressor. So how African Americans are able to take on this music becomes a more complex and meaningful tale than we have been willing to tell. Maybe Black dismantlings of German music and reimaginings of it fit Gayatri Spivak's notion of affirmative sabotage as well. What German music's universality and possibly hegemony could potentially offer, African American intellectuals argued, was a reimagining of Blackness and whiteness, free from American definitions of race and music in the era of Jim Crow. Writing with an intimate knowledge of the music of the great masters, they pushed for an imagined musical space that belonged to them during an era of white violence that denied their intellectual abilities, humanity, and physical safety. Because of their visions, German musical universalism had a far greater imaginary landscape than many of its ardent admirers could have ever have conceived possible. Thank you. Okay.
Start by just saying thank you so much for the talk. We have time for questions, and we have 2 microphones. So if you have a question, please feel free to make yourself to one of the microphones on either side of the auditorium. Sure.
Do you also ask me questions? Is this also how it goes?
I can ask you questions, but I thought we'd open it up first to see if anybody has a question. I think we have one over here. Please.
Hello. Hi. My name's Karen Nicholas. I'm a second-year PhD here with Jonathan Zatlin. And I was wondering, we had to read We had to read your article on Blackness and German identity for
Right.
our class, which was lovely.
Oh, cool.
And I was wondering if you could discuss more perhaps the idea of authenticity that you talked about in the conclusion.
Sure.
And how that might figure into subverting these ideas of Germanist and American identity and stuff like that.
Right. So this is going to like open up a big can of worms. Is that the expression, can of worms?
Yeah.
Right. Which is to say, so I've been talking a lot about the American, like how African Americans think about German music. But what you're talking about is like the flip side, which is my book, which is like thinking about how Germans understood, white Germans understood Black performers of classical music, right? And that, as I talk about in this article, there are all kinds of ways that they kind of have to do like a mental gymnastics to make sense of what they're hearing. So for example, right, like this idea, in essence, the idea being that these like primitive peoples, quote unquote Black people, are performing German music, which is supposed to be elite and sophisticated, and that they require some kind of, again, mental gymnastics is the best phrase that I can put for it, for them to understand it. So on the one hand, like we see white German audiences and music critics saying things like saying, for those who did it well, they would call them Negroes with white souls, right? As if somehow they had overcome their Blackness, as if it was a burden to them, right? And like had somehow mastered classical music. And that phrase implies that like also that classical music in their eyes was white, which I also thought was so interesting when I started thinking about it. And then the other side is if they didn't like the performance, oftentimes they would say, oh, but the singer somehow sounded Black, even though she was like singing Mozart, right? And her voice was smoky, it was like too smoky and dark, it was guttural, like those kinds of things, right? And so your question is about the conclusion of the article in particular, which is about, if I can ask you maybe more specifically, like what the question is.
So I was just wondering, like, so you see, like for the German audiences, that it was difficult for them to make sense of this phenomenon happening before them. But I'm also wondering if Black African Americans or just Black performers who were engaging in this kind of classical music, were they trying to find this form of authenticity in themselves, or was there that moment where it's like, I'm doing away with the concept of authenticity altogether?
Interesting. Yeah, like this concept of authenticity. You know, the goal, I think, for singers like Marian Anderson and Roland Hayes was to be, which was the goal for a lot of singers at the time, was to become a musical chameleon, right? That they could do anything, that they could sing. You know, there's a standard concert program by the 1920s that's in effect, where you're supposed to start off with like Bach and Handel, like music from like, you know, the Baroque period or whatever. Then you do maybe like a Mozart aria. Then you get to like the meaty stuff of the Brahms or the Hugo Wolf or whatever, you know, and then you can end with something from your own country. Like, so it could be like a Finnish person singing Finnish songs, or it could be like, you know, eventually for African Americans singing spirituals became part of like the set program at the end. And so the goal was for them to, I don't know if they thought in terms of authenticity. I think the goal was to be, like becoming musical chameleons and being just as good at this, if not better, than anybody else. You know, there's a sort of, but yeah, and so for those kinds of figures, the thing I find interesting is as they're pushing for musical excellence, they're not denying their own Blackness. Like they're still very committed to a certain kind of Black civil rights, and they're still very much committed to a certain kind of Black cultural politics. Marian Anderson commissioned Black composers to compose African American art songs for her all the time, as did Roland Hayes. So like they're still committed, you know, they want to have their cake and eat it too, and they just don't think that's a contradiction, if that helps.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
While our crowd is thinking, I had two questions.
Okay,
one
hey.
faster, one a little bigger. One was just about the Metropolitan Opera House, and I wondered if you could say more about the shutting down of that experiment, just to fill in some of the historical details.
Right. I wish there's a really great scholar named Lucy Kaplan who's writing about this. I think she's looked more into those documents than I have. But yeah, I mean, the word to use is shut down. Like that, at some point it became apparent to them that this humorous activity, like it was almost like they were humoring Edoardo Ferrari Fontana, the Italian tenor, and that at some point things had just gone too far, and that like they couldn't actually risk having a Black soprano perform at the Met. So I haven't looked into those documents myself, but I know Lucy Kaplan has, I think Carol Oja has, a couple other people. And like, yeah, I mean, what I found was, you know, I mean, the things I found were through African American newspapers, things like that as well, but it all seems to be, it's just like, it's going, and then it stops, which is really interesting.
And then another question, and y'all think about your questions. So I heard you sort of thinking through Gaines's argument about the appeal of classical music as a form of racial uplift, and I hear you both hearing that argument and pushing back on it. And I just wondered, how did Black musicians trained in classical music, how did they position themselves relative to, say, jazz or other popular forms of music?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that. Ooh. Which is to say, definitely positioning themselves against jazz in the 1920s and 30s. I feel like that starts changing after World War II. But also insisting, and this is not just them, but insisting that like there is something like African American art music that is worth exploring to them. In the form of like, well, why can't we also write like piano sonatas or fugues or things like that? And that goes back to certainly the 19th century with composers like Nathaniel Dett and others. So the thing I find interesting is this moment, perhaps, I feel like there's a clear split, which I need to read more into and learn more about. And again, this is me as like a German historian who's not actually an Americanist, right? But that there's a clear kind of split and division between figures like Alan Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were pushing for African-American art music, which means that it's still based, for better or worse, on Western art music. It's still supposed to, there's still this push to write symphonies, sonatas, and the like, using African-American musical expression, using musical idioms, using spirituals, and the like, and being like, this is the sort of corpus of material that we should be building, versus what I feel like what starts happening by the 1930s and 40s, people saying, why can't jazz be our art music, right? Which is, I think, the camp, to a certain extent, that like Langston Hughes finds himself in, even though later he does also commission an opera. So like, I don't know, he's contradictory, I guess you could say. But, I almost ended with the Langston Hughes story that gives this really interesting example of that, of like, of how he doesn't think the solution is to build anything using Western art music as a foundation, that he wants to reject that. By like 1934,
Y'all know I have lots of questions. I'm sure you do too, so please, sir.
Hi. I am not extremely knowledgeable about classical music, but I find it interesting that even today, I believe the abstract said like 1.8% of orchestras are Black African American. So classical music, of course, doesn't have the same exalted position today that it did back in the early 20th century. But, is this still like an ongoing fight, affirmative sabotage? I was just wondering if you could maybe speak about where this is modern times.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, the question of like, is this an ongoing fight? And I think the answer in a lot of ways is yes. And that what's also interesting to me is that it does feel like we're in a moment of flourishing as well, in terms of Black organizations really just taking off on their own and being like, well then, like, we're just gonna do our own thing if we can't get into, these different orchestras, et cetera, et cetera. So, and recognizing, and then I think the thing that's so exciting is recognizing that there are enough, like African-American musicians to do what they want. So, examples of this include Sphinx, which is an orchestra started, it's like an all-Black and Latinx orchestra that started back in the early 2000s to support, it started off supporting high school students, but now it goes beyond that. Actually, if you're looking for an organization to support here in Boston, Castle of Our Skins is amazing. And that is an organization dedicated to playing the music of Black composers, alive and dead, I guess you could say. And what was the other thing I was just thinking of in terms of like organizations or things like that? Decompose. I mean, so we're in this really interesting moment, I have to say, of a sort of flourishing of organizations, ensembles, and the like, that are just finding ways to continue concertizing anyway. You know, I think this is what I was thinking of, which is also what you're talking about, or what this reminds me of, is like, I was talking about this earlier at lunch today, that people were so surprised for Beyonce's Homecoming, like the documentary that you could watch on Netflix or whatever, and people were so surprised that she found like all of these Black violinists, but I was like, you should not be surprised. Like, I mean, you shake a tree and you can find violinists like coming out of a tree, you know, so the idea that, so there's this, in other words, I'm saying this to say that like the idea can still be that there aren't somehow classically trained musicians, and that's just like a myth that you just have to keep fighting against and being like, they are there, they are performing, they're literally doing Beyonce's Homecoming, right? Mm-hmm. But it's more than like, why are they not appearing in orchestras, or why are we still having difficulties with casting in opera houses and things like that? So
awesome. Yeah, I'll have to look those organizations up.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Castle of Our Skins, they're great in, yeah, they're based in here, right here in Boston.
I think we have some questions from our online participants.
We can't hear you. Sorry. Is that thing on? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. They said, as I've been reflecting on this time period, I was wondering whether you found writings or other evidence of African American artists responding to or encountering stories of German colonialism in Africa in the early 20th century, and how that might affect their relationship to German art music.
Oh, that's a great question. And sadly, no. I mean, this is I shouldn't say that until, well, no, that I mean, and I'm not the first one to say this. I do recognize that what's so interesting to think about, what these different quotes about how Europe is better, right? How Europe was better for African Americans on the ground, perhaps, or they felt that to be the case. But that Africans are having a very different experience, right? And Afro-Germans are having a very different experience, which is also kind of what I think I meant earlier in the talk about how to really investigate these claims. Like, I want to recognize both the truth of that experience for Black people in the 19th and 20th centuries, while at the same time also holding space for different kinds of identities that are having different kinds of Black identities that are having different experiences in Germany, whether they're German colonial Africans or Afro-Germans and the like. So yeah, so that's a really great question. But yeah, like there's less conversation about that than you might think, or that we would hope. And then part of me, again, this is not just me, it's other German historians who started pushing back and arguing that there's something a little bit deliberate about ignoring, you know, other kinds of Black experiences in Germany at the same time that's going on. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Black Beethoven.
Okay.
I know.
Sure.
And I love how you are opening that up to think about what those questions help us to see as historians. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how Black Beethoven arguments have persisted into the contemporary.
Yeah.
And as they were arising in the 1940s, how they were picked up by the reading public in Germany.
Oh, interesting. Oh, the little that I know of that is like outrage and like incredulity in terms of how the German audience has picked up on it, as well as one of the things that I'm also hoping to look into more in the future, and there's a documentary film project hopefully happening on this that I'm a part of, is there was a founding of the first ever, one of the first ever like all Black orchestras in the 1930s, the National Negro Orchestra, and it's led by a former, a conductor from Germany, and German newspapers, when they discovered that he's conducting an all-black orchestra in the States are like, they think it's outrageous. They're like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? They're so incredulous. So, so that's also just what that brought to mind. But the question was like, how does this Black Beethoven idea, like, how does it persist? How does it live on? Or what? I mean, there are so many reasons why it's appealing. And why I understand the appeal of it. And I have to say, Black Twitter, this is like 2020, 2021, I feel like, when this happened. Black Twitter was hilarious. I mean, they like, some of the tweets were like so good and so funny, and made me laugh a lot. But in essence, like, I think it boils down to a couple of things. There's a way that, in white American society, they like the constant denial of something like Black genius. And so what's so interesting about claiming Beethoven then, it's sort of this sneaky move of like saying we're going to take like one of the biggest geniuses, right? That's like that we everybody recognizes and sort of claim him as ours, claim that he's Black. So oftentimes it's like a push to recognize genius. And then the other thing that I have found also, what I also have to remind people of, especially when looking at scholarship from the 1930s, 40s, and the like, is that, and this maybe sounds like unpleasant, but so be it, which is that, from the perspective of like this new generation of university-trained African-American intellectuals, historians who are trying to break through also into American academia, that they recognize, rightly so, that any kind of Black history had been understudied or dismissed or ignored, and that there was so much of a fascinating global Black history that they were starting to really uncover, and that just hadn't been written about in any kind of book or textbook or anything like that. And so I say that to say that maybe this is like the unpleasant part, which is that from the perspective of some African American, historians, intellectuals, writing in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and ongoing as well, I would say, the fact that, the discipline of history had not taken seriously Black history meant a couple of different things. I mean, it meant that they had, that history was taught from a white frame from their perspective. And that also, I think, when we look at these different writings, I mean, the real indictment is, that if a white musicologist in like 1957 were to push back against this claim that like Beethoven was Black, that from the perspective of like other African-American historians and musicologists at the time, they'd say, well, we have no reason to trust you. Like, why should we trust you? When so much of your scholarship, deliberately excludes, deliberately marginalizes, deliberately, and that so much of what we found out that we've uncovered existed all this whole time, but that you wouldn't look at. So there's this, I do want to hold space for that. Like, there's a reason why these claims persist, because, why should, from the perspective of, I guess not only somebody on Twitter, but like from different kinds of Black people, like, why should we trust white scholarship? Yeah. Is there a microphone or?
Can you hear me?
Yes, okay, hooray.
Great. We have another question from our online audience. They asked, would you say that this focus on German classical music is located among the discourse or archival cultural currency of racial uplift ideology of Du Bois' period?
What was the question? Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Would you say that this focus on German classical music is located amongst the discourse or archival cultural currency of racial uplift ideology of the Du Bois period?
I still don't understand the question, but yes, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna have Anthony's gonna translate. Okay, yeah.
If I'm hearing right, is the interest in German classical music arising from a broader discourse of racial
uplift
during Du Bois's era?
Oh, from that, okay, I didn't know if it meant like today or like from the time. Oh, like this interest in Beethoven or the interest in the...
I think the German
classical music. Tradition. Oh, okay, right. Yes, the answer is yes. Like, it's definitely tied to racial uplift. It's tied to, again, the idea, and this is the first chapter of my book, if anybody wants to buy it or read it, which is looking at like African-American institutions of higher education, and how they all have this agenda, or most of them do, I should say, that if they're going to start a school of music, they have to do it the right way, right? And that it's not just them, it is also Oberlin. This is, so many different colleges are convinced that like they need to have the right kind of musical training and education in order to have the best kinds of students. So yes, that classical music becomes very much part of that conversation in the way that, it's the same kind of conversation about the talented 10th, right, which is a W.E.B. Du Bois phrase, that like we should be cultivating our own Shakespeare's, we should also be cultivating our own Beethovens, right? And so that's part of the impetus behind also establishing these conservatories of music at Black colleges, yeah.
To build off that question, one of the themes you brought out so nicely was how much of this conversation could also be used as a kind of tool to critique America as a project, right?
Oh, yeah.
So what was the relationship between sort of, Black musicians seeing this as a place to think about critiques of America? How did that work with a kind of, with the other side of the sort of German approach to think of this as like German, right? Like it's universal, but it's also German.
But it's also German,
right? Like it's a critique of America, but it's also white Europe, right?
Yeah.
How were they navigating that?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I don't want to say it's naivete, because that's not fair. They were really eager to get to Germany and Austria and to Europe in general to perform. Like it felt like the promised land. I mean, that's really how I describe it actually at various times in my book, that if they could make it in Europe, they could make it anywhere, right? And to a certain extent, there is some truth to that, basically that joke about like there being two types of music, German music and bad music, meant that if you could get German audiences or European audiences to take you seriously, and if you could get their endorsements, like you could come back to the States like an international superstar, a household name, which is very much what happens for different performers like Marian Anderson and Roland Hayes. For people who know for Marian Anderson, the famous African-American contralto, there's this incident in 1939 when she is denied the ability to sing at the Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and instead sings on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in front of hundreds of thousands of people. Millions listen on the radio. It's like this sort of big defiance, this big sort of civil rights movement. And the thing that I constantly remind people of is that like the reason why this became such a big deal is because she had already proven herself in Europe. Right, like she had already gotten the big impresarios, the big conductors, the big performers to applaud her, love her, endorse her. She had all of this backing when she came back to the States to perform again, which is to come when she was denied by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Like that was a shock. It was like the audacity of turning down this international superstar, from their perspective. Again, it's like turning down Beyonce or something for like, the super, I don't know, something like that. Like from their perspective, like she had already made it. Same thing with, and I forget the year that Roland Hayes performs here in Boston, but he performs here in Boston with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. I want to say it's like 27, 28, but in part he's the first Black musician to perform here at the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and he's able to do it because he already had made a name for himself in Vienna. When he comes back to the United States in 1924, he's making $100,000 a year in 1924, like already, right? So he is a huge deal. He's huge on the market. And it means that it makes it much more difficult for orchestra halls and opera houses to turn him down, which is what he wanted. Yeah.
Any final questions?
Hello. With your example about finding Black melodies in a Beethoven scherzo, I was curious, do you feel that there's a tension between like the response of it being celebrated and lifting up as an example of seeing yourself within it, and then the flip side of it being something that was, taken probably without much input or like quote unquote bastardized? Do you find a tension there?
Can you repeat the last bit of what you're saying? That like the tension between like celebrating the idea that Beethoven's music is like based on like some sort of Negro folk theme versus the feeling, and like, or are there criticisms at the time that like this is a form of like this is a form of like bastardization or something?
Well, honestly, my idea came from, I think if somebody did this today, they would call it appropriation.
Okay.
You know, like, was there maybe that sort of a conversation, or is that just like a modern frame?
Oh, interesting. And appropriation meaning, I guess the thing I'm still seeking clarity on is like that Beethoven had appropriated, or that the people who are claiming Beethoven had this music, that they were the ones appropriating, I guess.
No, that Beethoven was taking something
Oh,
and
okay,
using
I
it
see.
without
I see.
uplifting
Yeah.
it.
Oh, yeah. No, that especially in the late 19th century, so many Black musicians and intellectuals are looking for any kind of ammo, right, that they can use to convince white American mainstream classical music world to take them seriously, right? So they're willing to explore anything, which is part of what makes these different claims sometimes so outrageous, right? I do want to recognize that they sometimes sound outrageous. And yeah, because it's like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks, right? That so no, they're not, that's not the conversation. There is a conversation similarly to that though, later on with Antonin Dvorak and the New World Symphony, and I'm not, again, I will turn to other scholars who have talked about this, Douglas Shadle, who's talked about it, the frustration of Black composers at the time saying, like, yes, this is a really great piece of music, but we've also been doing this for a while. Like, why is it that he's getting credit for creating American music when, like, we've also been creating American music, right? So that's, I think, what's so interesting to me is that is now becoming more of the conversation in the last, I would say, 10 years or so. It's like rethinking Antonin Dvorak's statement and rethinking the composer Antonin Dvorak's role as like the creator of American music, if that makes sense, the creator of like American art music, the founder of it. You know, that there was no American music at all until like, in the 19th century, and then like in comes Dvorak. And like now there's American music, like now we have like Copeland and like all of that. And instead with Doug Shadle and other musicologists say, actually there were Black composers at the time who were kind of critical and being like, we are right here, like we've been here this whole time. So I think that's an interesting conversation. I'm curious to see what happens with in the next like however many years with orchestras and the like. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you both. It's been such a pleasure.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much. Yay, thanks.
And thank you all for coming. I hope you'll join us for upcoming Arts and Sciences 150th anniversary events. Please check your email and visit our website to stay connected. Thanks and have a good evening.